Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker. Is every marriage doomed to experience one conflict after another? Certainly not, says Dr. Ron Welch. In this practical and encouraging book, he outlines the 10 specific choices you can make to minimize conflict and enjoy joy in your marriage. And increase joy in your marriage. With his expert guidance, you'll learn how to communicate accurately and positively, choose forgiveness over unforgiveness, understand your marriage type, and make decisions more effectively. Whether you're engaged, newly married, or have been married for decades, you'll find that this book will transform your relationship. Dr. Ron Welch is the author of The Controlling Husband, which received extensive national exposure. He serves on the faculty of Denver Seminary and has 25 years of experience in clinical psychology. Dr. Welch has developed the transformational marriage approach, which helps couples through counseling, seminars, and publications. He's a regular guest contributor on Daybreak USA and Denver's The Good News with Angie Austin. He's been a guest and psychology expert on several national radio programs, including Family Life Today. He and his wife, Jan, live in Colorado. Here to discuss his new book, 10 Choices Successful Couples Make, The Secret to Love That Lasts a Lifetime, is Dr. Ron Welch. Ron, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here. So, you've arrived at a place in your life when you're able to not only take the collective examination of the people you interact with, but your own experiences in your own marriage, and come up with a guideline, a handbook, something that is practical. It's not the regular marriage book that talks about particular issues or this issue or that issue. It's a book of a framework that establishes a foundation for a successful marriage. If we take a look at you today, you are a product of years of experience and influences. And there's many people who have contributed to your life, but no more so than your mom and dad, and no more so than the home you grew up with. And I would like you to take our audience on a little journey back to what little Ron was like, and what life was like for him, and where he finally came to the conclusions he did about marriage, modeling marriage, and his faith.
I grew up in a fairly small farm town in Idaho, and we had very clear family values, spent a lot of time together as a family. My dad was a hard worker. Mom was fairly concerned about bad things happening, so she kind of was a glass half empty, draining rapidly kind of individual. And so I learned to be kind of wary about the future, looked for things that might go wrong. I was very successful in a lot of things I did when I was younger, but I also was uncertain other people would see those kind of successes. So you've heard the term narcissism thrown around in our society. I think a narcissist individual is more like a scared little boy who doesn't want other people to see behind the curtain a bit and know what their weaknesses are. And so I spent a lot of my early years, even in my marriage, trying to project that I was in control of everything. That first book, The Controlling Husband, comes out of a lot of my background and my story. My first anniversary, my wife said, "You're treating me like a bird in a gilded cage. You need to let me free, and you need to stop being so controlling." I wish I could say God just solved everything and that was it and everything got better, but it was about a 10-year journey back and forth of trying to figure out how to trust God, how to not feel like I had to make the decisions. I would send him the emails that said, "Here's what we need to do, God." And it was very difficult on my wife. She came from a family where her father was very dominant, and so she was used to someone being in control. And that was our story for many years. And I recall it was so clear. There was a time when my younger boys were starting to order her around a bit and tell her what to do and say, "Be here or do that." And I gave them the father lecture, right? "Don't talk to your mom like that." And then I remember God slapping me across the face and saying, "Well, who do you think is teaching them these things?" And I began to learn that I was providing an example for my sons of how to treat women disrespectfully and dishonorably. That's where my faith really came together, because I had said all the right things, gone to church all my life, been a part of congregations, but I hadn't necessarily looked in the mirror every morning when I got up and said, "Am I consistent with the man God wants me to be?" And so the last 15, 20 years of our marriage, I've worked very hard to try to develop an understanding every day of what choices God wants me to make so that I can be a man who honors and creates a scenario where my wife grows closer to God each day.
You know, you paint this amazing picture of that old movie, The Wizard of Oz, where they say, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Right. Right.
And the one that's pulling the strings and the one that's making the things happen. But that was your father, that was my father. You know, if he didn't say yay or nay, it didn't happen. He charted the course and directed the path for everything. It was his way or it was the wrong way. And you spent a whole lot of time in that wrong way kind of path, and you carry that forward. You approach life that way. It is not and a message that I think that both of you want to, both of us want to project is that role models. We take our cues from those. We say we're never going to say what our fathers say or never going to do what our parents do, but that's the only basis and foundation we have. We can't help. We cannot control unless we are deliberate, intentional, and we have a clear plan, an exit plan. It really is an exit strategy to get rid of the old. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 5:17 that the old is gone and the new has come, but that's a great message for our heart. But our minds are still attached to the thought processes of what does it sound like, what's it supposed to look like, well, how is it supposed to be? And we have this image in our mind, and although it says so a man thinks in his heart, so he does, it actually, there's a lot of battle, a lot of conflict between that heart-mind connection. So when your wife said that to you, those are pretty profound words. They're eloquent. Obviously, you married a highly intelligent, articulate, and capable woman who was really saying to you, you know, you're overly protective, you're overly controlling, and I'm not this. I want to be a delicate flower, and I want to be loved and cherished as a delicate flower, but I want to be respected as an equal, and in the Hebrew, ezo kenegdo, I'm to be your helpmate, which means I'm to be by your side. You can't push me off and do it all by yourself.
You may have remembered years ago they used to do experiments with cats and dogs back before PETA would protect animals, and they would have cats on an electrical grid or dogs, and they'd shock them and they'd jump. They'd lay back down and they'd shock them and they'd jump. And eventually the cat or dog would look at the experimenter and say, I'm just laying down. You can shock me, but you can't make me jump. There's that learned helplessness experience. And my wife had learned a lot of that in her family growing up, and even more with me, that it was better not to rock the boat. Maybe if I just don't bring something up, Ron won't get upset tonight. And I became the object of her fear to avoid. She told me there were days when I would be coming home from work and she would kind of think, okay, what have I not done that he's going to get upset about? When I realized that was the effect I was having, that was my Christian witness, those were very harsh lessons to have to be aware of, and to be able to turn to God and say, I can't live this way anymore.
But you know, Ron, what you're talking about is something that's very, very biblical. And I tell people a lot of times that if you can't find yourself in the Bible, you've never read the Bible. Abraham went through a series of 8 very specific encounters with the Lord, went through a lot of tests, and they were pass-fail, and he failed quite a few of them. The ultimate test, the final test in Genesis 22, the sacrifice of Isaac, he passed, and that was the final test for Abraham. Being a believer is problem, promise, and then provision. It is a matter of testing, not temptation. God does test us. God does not tempt us. And it's because he wants to refine us, because he wants us to bear good fruit. So your boys are talking to your wife the way you're talking to your wife. These are some real radical wake-up calls that many men, quite honestly, would run away from.
I don't think I had a choice. It was one of those situations where you have to either give up your faith or you give up your behavior. You can't do both at the same time, because there's such a a dichotomy between the two. And yeah, I guess I could have made the choice to say, well, maybe God doesn't really want me to do this, or I could make excuses. I made excuses for a lot of my life, but I guess I reached a point where I was asked by God to determine, do you really believe in what you're professing and praying about and learning about and teaching? Because I was, I'm working in the prison system at the time. By the way, I wasn't an inmate, and I was a psychologist, but I was in the prison system with a lot of inmates in very dark, negative kind of environment. Wasn't a good father, wasn't a good husband. And you look at those things and you say, okay, do you trust God to heal you and redeem you or not? And they talk about the dark night of the soul. That was it for me.
It's interesting that you talk about your testimony being, for lack of a better word, tainted.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
When Pharaoh approached Abraham and said, God met me in a dream and told me not to do this thing, why did you do it to me? What is it you're trying to do to me? He did it to Abimelech as well, who wasn't a believer. 2 times we have an account where non-believers convicted a believer of bad behavior. It's one thing when a non-believer convicts you of bad behavior. It's another thing when God convicts you of bad behavior.
And the message is usually pretty darn clear. You have to choose, and I think we all reach those crossroads. That's what these choices are about. Is this is not necessarily rocket science, but you have a choice that you have to make in that moment of whether you're going to follow God or follow your own sinful nature. And we all make those choices, and the consequences are pretty severe from them.
Where do you start in this process? I mean, you had quite a cathartic experience. You're confronted with the behavior of your sons, you're confronted by your wife, and then you're confronted by God. And then ultimately, the one you have to confront is yourself.
Yes.
And Paul made it very clear that that is the hardest one of all to confront.
Mm-hmm. I think the challenge for me was, even once I made that decision, and I wanted to, day by day, try to act differently and be differently, I suddenly realized other people around me were experiencing me just the same way. And that made it even harder, because now I'm realizing, well, I thought I was a nice guy. I thought I was somebody people liked, because they had always, in some ways, somewhat been afraid of me a bit. It was even harder when, as I tried to make changes, Jan really didn't believe that they were real. So 6 months would go by and I would really have a pretty good track record, and then something would happen. And I'm a kind of guy that if I get highly stressed, I'm a type AAA personality, so I'm doing a lot of things all the time. And in those stressful moments, I'm less in control. So I'd have a bad day for some reason, and then she's like, oh, well, old Ron's back. I know that guy. And then now she's back to expecting the worst. So one of her changes in the relationship was she had to start trusting God to help me become the man she wanted to be married to, and believe that I would be capable of that. And that was really hard for her, with her dad being so harsh. My dad was strong and controlling in some ways and powerful, but I always got the feeling he had our best interest at heart. And I think my family has believed that as well. Her dad, I'm not so sure. He was pretty strong, and she had a lot of very difficult, challenging experiences. So for her to believe I was actually going to be different was really hard.
So can you get there? Can you hit this, what would appear in the natural to be a point of no return?
Mm-hmm.
What in today's environment, divorce is so easy to get.
Yep.
People throw it around all the time. There are states that have no-fault divorce. You file on a Monday. It's 30 days later, it's final. If there's nobody to contest it, it's over. Marriage, parenting, there's no tests, there's no training for it. I'm an adoptive parent. I had to go through months of extensive training and background checks and tens of thousands of dollars to adopt a child. And it occurred to me during that whole process that, people with no training, no skills, nothing whatsoever, are
Right.
popping children out left and right, and I'm having to pay to go to classes to become a parent and all these things.
Yep.
It should be required for everybody,
Yep.
but it's
I
not.
think I think you can get there. I think that you look at what you did and what you had to do to train yourself and understand yourself and prepare yourself. That's what I had to do in my own development, is to say, I got to go back to school again and figure out what I don't know and why I'm having so much difficulty. So it took a lot of mentors, counselors, family support, friends of mine that I said, hey, I need you to be my accountability partner. You've got to tell me when I'm coming across this way. I even open my classes now at Denver Seminary, and I'll talk to students and say, hey, this is kind of how sometimes students experience me. Please don't write in my evaluation 16 weeks later that he was rude. Come talk to me that first week and say, this is how you're coming across. And I think when you start opening yourself up to a lot of people to be able to tell you and interact with you, and you're authentic like that, then it's a lot easier to make those changes. And with couples, it's the same way. If you get people around you and say, this is the kind of wife I'd like to be, this is the kind of husband I'd like to be, talk to your kids about the kind of father or mother you'd like to be, suddenly everybody's on the same team helping you become who God wanted you to be. I think that's what living in community as a Christian is all about.
Is it a lie from the pit that you could be married to somebody that doesn't want that same thing that they've already, you're wanting to change, you're wanting to go through this, you want to get better, and you don't see them on board with it? What they want you to do is they want you to conform to their reality, and the way they want you to do it is for you to go through these changes so you can become malleable, so you can become more responsive, but they're going to hold steadfast to their position, and you're going to have to revolve around them.
Yeah, I completely agree. I have spouses that will come in and call me in my private practice, and they'll say something about, I want to change, and he has no interest in changing, so I have no hope and no idea how the marriage could ever get better. And I talk to them about setting some small boundaries, about making sure they're behaving the way they feel God calls them to behave, because sometimes they fall into their own patterns and they're destructive in their own ways. But at some point, there is a mutual back and forth kind of change process that occurs. I believe there's a couple of models of marriage in the world today. I think one is very self-focused. It's all about me. There was a USA Network show a few years ago called The Starter Wife, this idea that there's a starter marriage and you trade up to something better if the person doesn't meet your needs. And then there's this alternative view of the Christian biblical view that involves servants and sacrifice and servanthood and caring for the other partner. That model involves two partners, both serving each other. And if that's not happening, then sometimes I think a third party needs to be involved, a pastor, a rabbi, someone who can help them talk through it, even a marriage mentoring couple or a professional. But at that point, if one partner's saying, I will not change, this is who I am, take it or leave it, then I think there's some serious issues related to the vows they made when they got married.
You know, it's interesting that as we pick our spouses, the reasons that we pick our spouses are varied. There's a common thought that says that girls marry their dads and
Sure.
and that boys marry their moms, and those things that attracted them to that. So we tend to carry that old model into it because that's our desire.
That's right.
Is for something similar because we're comfortable in that environment. That doesn't mean it's a good environment. It just means that that's the environment we're comfortable in. So how do people get started? What's the starting point? In your case, you had a number of ignitions that all took place kind of back to back to back, where all of a sudden all 8 of your cylinders had to fire because you had your wife, you had your kids, you had your students, you had your workmates. Everybody was kind of telling you the same thing in different ways. That, hey, Ron, you're a great guy, but there's some things you got to work on because this isn't working. Right.
I think that the fire is ignited by hope. And I think that's the very, very first step in any counselor's experience with a couple, in a couple who's maybe listening on your show that is just has no belief that things can get better. This is who we are. It's who we've always been. There's nothing we can do. We either live in misery or we get divorced. I mean, that's door number 1 and door number 2. Door number 3 that provides hope is one that says, what if you could experience some small successes? I have couples come in who are yelling and screaming at each other, and my first interaction with them is to say, well, what if you just didn't yell so loud? And they look at me as if, well, that seems kind of ridiculous. And then I ask them during the week, I'll say, well, if you have to yell, why don't you just not do that and not talk at all? And they figure that that's going to be a failure, and they come in and they'll say, we had a horrible week. We didn't talk. We just ignored each other all week. We just didn't talk. And I'll ask them to give me a high five and talk about how successful they are at this therapy thing and say, you can't tell me you're not capable of change, because this week, instead of yelling and screaming and saying hurtful things, you didn't do that. So you can have some hope that at the very least you cannot do the bad things you used to do. They look at me and they're kind of shocked a bit, and then they think, well, how did we do that? What exactly happened? And they made a choice to have a small success. It wasn't big. It wasn't like suddenly their marriage was beautiful, but they did decide not to do more hurtful things that would have to forgive each other for. And I think your listeners can be fairly confident that the hope comes from small successes in achievable goals that would be things like, can we just spend 1 hour this week not talking about money and just take a walk together? That would be an interesting change. And then suddenly they start to believe that change is possible.
You know, there's a name that you probably recognize, Dr. John Trent, who wrote a book years ago called Heart Shift. And he said, you know, the world comes at you, especially New Year's, and says, you got to go on a diet, you got to increase your exercise, you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to read 20 books in a year, you've got to read your Bible every day, all these things, and then you wind up, you're a complete and total failure because you didn't accomplish any of them. But what if the person that weighs 450 pounds and has 4 desserts at lunch and 6 desserts at dinner, and he says to them, just only have 5 desserts at dinner, not 6?
There you go.
Just have 5. You mean you're not telling me to give up desserts completely. You're not telling me to give up everything that I love. Just cut out 1 dessert? That's all you're telling me I need to do. That's right. That's where the process begins. Just cut out 1 dessert, all right? And then over a course of a month, 1 dessert is going to cause a 1 or 2 pound loss in weight. Say, okay, let's weigh you in. Okay, I lost 2 pounds. What did you do differently? I only cut out 1 dessert. Well, what do you think cutting out 1 dessert at lunch would do for you? He said, well, it would double those results. Well, if you're looking to set a goal, changing too many things. There was a movie that Jodie Foster did years ago called Contact. And,
oh yeah, I remember that.
She was with her dad before he died, and they were there at a radio, and he would sit there and make these small changes, and she'd spin the dial. And he'd reach over and he'd put his hand on top of hers, and he said to her, small change, small moves, Ellie, small moves. And that stuck with me. That movie's probably, what, 25 years old now? Yeah. That stuck with me because we're not capable of sustainable, long-term, big change because we're not wired that way. We are wired to sustainable, small change, but only a small number of small changes at a single time. And I think this really is part of the process that you have expanded on and made in a very practical way. We're talking with Dr. Ron Welch, author of 10 Choices Successful Couples Make, The Secret to Love That Lasts a Lifetime. When was the last time you heard of a couple celebrating their golden anniversary? One of your peers. Now, I know that my parents celebrated theirs, but in today's environment, millennials are not seeing their parents at their 25th wedding anniversaries because the divorce rate is so high. The absentee father rate is so high. And so the role models that we have established some of those are not in place anymore, but that doesn't mean that has to continue. And that means that when you face conflict, even before marriage, even in picking your right partner, if you approach it from this practical choices and programs that Dr. Ron Welch has laid out for you, you can avoid some of the pitfalls. That doesn't mean, just like following Messiah doesn't mean you're going to have a perfect life. It doesn't mean you're going to have a perfect marriage, but you can find joy and contentment and true love in a marriage that's built on these foundations. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to continue in this discussion of what 10 choices successful couples can make that's going to open up a lifetime of love. We'll be right back. Not everything that makes the headlines has biblical importance, but many events that happen around the world do, and you never hear about them. Igniting a Nation is pleased to teach Revealing Prophecy every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. at the Marriott 280 in Birmingham. We will cover worldwide events and insider information that will connect the dots of what's happening around the world with biblical prophecy. If you happen to miss a class, we'll televise each week's class at 10 o'clock Central Time on ignitinganation.com and all our social media outlets. Copies of the teachings will also be available to purchase on our website at www.ignitinganation.com. The Lord meets you right where you are, and so does Igniting a Nation's new live streaming outlets. You can now watch Revealing the Truth, Revealing the Bible, and Prophecy Revealed simulcast live each Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 1 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time on YouTube Live, Facebook Live, Vimeo, Periscope, and through our website, www.ignitinganation.com. No matter what device you are using, our program will automatically scale so you won't have to miss a single program. And if you happen to miss an episode, you can always subscribe to the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel and access over 1,000 interviews and never miss your favorite authors, special guests, and topics that interest you the most.
There are lots of ways to see Israel, but nothing compares to seeing the land of the book and the people of the book through the eyes of two Jewish believers who can take you on a journey that will bring the entire Bible to life. When you join Rabbi Eric Walker and his #1 rated tour guide, Edo Canaan, in Israel, you'll experience incredible teachings, first-class accommodations, and actually walk where Jesus walked. You will experience the Bible transforming from black and white into living color, and you will never see the Bible in the same way again. For more information, visit us at www.ignitinganation.com/events.
The Lord contends with what contends with you, and Igniting a Nation is committed to bringing to light each and every issue that faces a believer's life. Our live stream programming and teachings take you on a journey to finding biblical truth from a wide variety of experts who share their insights into a deeper walk with the Lord. We have assembled the most comprehensive panel of experts in the fields of prophecy, caregiving, healing from trauma, shame, and abuse, and so much more. We continue to expand our teachings and programming to meet your needs. We're committed to healing the nations with biblical truth. Visit www.ignitinganation.com to develop a deeper walk with the Lord and start your journey to a transformed life. The Bible commands us to study to show ourselves approved, but most study using Bible study tools and not actually studying the Bible chapter and verse. Igniting a Nation is pleased to present Revealing the Bible, recorded and taught each week before a live audience. We take you deeper into the actual Bible and verse in both Hebrew and English and connect the dots between the Old and New Testament. You can attend our 2 classes in Tuscaloosa and Birmingham or watch the program every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Central Time on ignitinganation.com and all our other simulcast outlets. For more information, visit www.ignitinganation.com/events. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Dr. Ron Welch, author of 10 Choices Successful Couples Make, The Secret to Love That Lasts a Lifetime. Dr. Ron Welch, welcome back to Revealing the Truth.
Thank you so much, sir.
Ron, when we were talking about how your process for reconciliation and for renewal began, and it's an ongoing process. But where does a couple start the process if they both feel hurt, tired, and have little hope?
I think you have to start by asking yourselves, first of all, are you committed to fixing the problem? Because if one person has one foot out the door, I'll have couples walk into my office and I have them rate how highly are you likely interested in staying married. If someone's already decided they're done, that's a problem. So both parties have to really look at themselves and say, did we mean our vows? What does that look like? Just because society says there's an out clause doesn't mean our marriage has an out clause. And so if we want to fix this, what would it look like to fix it? Because I think some parties kind of look at it and say, gosh, I'm not really interested in change. I'm sort of who I am, and you have to accept that. The hope comes from trying things that then allow you to take small baby steps and begin to feel like you're making some initial progress, even if that's something like saying, hey, today, why don't we try to say something nice instead of something negative? Our research says it takes 7 positive things to make up for every negative thing. The research has been shown that over and over and over again. So I have couples that come in the first 5 minutes of a session and they'll say all these negative things about each other and correction and criticism. And I'll ask them to do the math and they've got about 400 positive things to say before the hour's over. It's hard when it's always critical. So one thing I ask them to do is to see what might happen if you would try today to say as many positive things and the things you like about each other as the things you don't.
Do the statistics bear out that men are more reluctant to seek out marital counseling than women?
Yes, I think so. I think it's clearly more often, at least the individual who seeks help is often the woman.
Do you find that men don't understand that the counseling process is not only biblical, which is the foundation of mentoring and confessing your sins one to another? God is faithful to forgive us our sins. Have we framed it where it's an unmanly thing? Have we framed it where it's all you're going to do is get me into a room and have a referee and you're going to beat me up and he's going to throw a penalty flag? How do you do that, Ron? How do we get the message out to men that healthy marital counseling is something that's going to be a blessing to the marriage for a lifetime and a blessing to their children for generations to come?
I think your analogy is interesting of the referee who's throwing a penalty flag, because a lot of the men have this impression that it will now be 2 against 1. The counselor is going to gang up on them with their wife, and it will be a matter of being told how they need to change. That means the assumption is I'm the problem. And I think that's where we need to start, to be able to say, well, what if the marriage were not just about me? What if it were based on the other person? What if it were selfless rather than selfish? This whole concept of my needs being met in a relationship really concerns me. I think it's central to all of the choices people need to make in marriage. I think it underlies a lot of the different problems that I see in my counseling office. I certainly hear about it from the students I teach. There's this idea that everything is a battle. There's this competition for scarce resources, and we're not cooperating together to try to work out the problem. We're having to fight to get our needs met. So when I enter a conversation with my spouse, I have to have all of my reasons lined up for why I can prove that my way is right. And I think that whole experience is flawed from the beginning. It's not the way we should be approaching a relationship.
You know, I've said to people in the past, and I'll ask you if I'm right or if I'm wrong. I tell them at times you're going to have to make a choice of would you rather be right or rather be happy?
Yes, I think that's true, because sacrifice is not always about getting what you want. Compromise isn't about getting what you want. Sometimes it's a matter, this is how it used to work in my relationship. I would ask my wife what she wanted for dinner, but I really wasn't asking what she wanted. I wanted to start a conversation so I could suggest that we have barbecue. Does that make sense? That's a different conversation. Now I ask my wife what she wants for dinner, and then she says, well, what do you want for dinner? And then we're pulling over on the side of the road because we can't decide where to go, but we're both considering the other person's needs, and we're trying to make sure the other person's needs gets met. I'd much rather have a couple at an impasse because they don't know how to serve each other than at an impasse because they're competing to get their way.
You know, as much as I want to talk about these 10 choices that successful couples make, where do we get so lost in the message that says that husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church, and wives, respect your husbands. Esteem the other more than yourself. Let no unwholesome talk come from your mouth, but only that which is for the encouragement and the uplifting for the other. Am I wrong in the assumption that if I am meeting your needs, if I'm putting you first, and I'm serving your needs, and you are reflecting that back to me, mathematically, don't both of our needs get met?
Absolutely. And even better, I'm not having to endorse my own selfish desire to meet my own needs in the process. It makes complete sense. But I still have wives who will call up, I'll get a referral call, and they'll say, well, I've been told I need to be more submissive, so I need to have us come into counseling so I can be more submissive. And I'll ask about that to try to understand what part of Ephesians 5 is being read. And she'll say, well, it's not my husband or my pastor who tell me that. It's other women in the church who tell me I need to be more submissive. So you have this process by which some people assume the good Christian wife is the one who just does what she's told. And I don't think, in the long run, a husband who is telling another partner what to do and a wife who feels less than in some way, I'm not sure in the long run that's what Ephesians 5 is talking about. So I think there's a perception that power and control are involved in submission rather than teamwork and leadership and working under each other. There's so many ways you can endorse, whether you're egalitarian or complementarian or complegalitarian or whatever you want to say, those models of marriage shouldn't be based on one person being less than the other or somehow non-powerful in the process.
You know, in the Bible, we see several instances in God telling a man not to listen to his wife, as was the case with Abraham and Sarah in regards to Hagar. But then we see the first time that God says, listen to your wife, do what she says, which was when Sarah, when Ishmael was abusing Isaac, and Sarah brought it to Abraham's attention, and God said, listen to your wife, do what she tells you, put the boy out, put the boy and his mother out. So in the Bible, there is a balance of do what your wife says, don't do what your wife says. We've perverted in the pulpit this message that women don't have a voice. The first revival broke out at the woman at the well. The Samaritan woman, the very first revival in the New Testament, broke out. An entire city was saved because of a woman. So this whole thing about how we've taken doctrine and we've created an environment that makes it submissive means under, as opposed to, look, we're going to discuss this, but when it comes down to the final decision, God's going to bless unity in a marriage. He's not going to bless disunity in a marriage. Couples, in your book, you talk about couples have to take responsibility for the choices that they make within their marriage, but there's often times that they don't feel like they have a choice. They're kind of boxed into a corner. How do you help them navigate out of the corner and, look, I hate to say it, but back into the center of the ring?
Right. The analogy I use is, I don't know if you've ever been to Niagara Falls. Big waterfall, lots of water. My Canadian friends are clearly feel the Canadian side is prettier than the American side. But regardless, it's an analogy for marriage. And a lot of the couples I work with, I first dealt with this analogy when we were working with inmates who were very angry. And a guy named Bill Fleeman had a program for dealing with angry inmates who had problems controlling their impulses. And I thought about that in marriage, and I thought our conflicts occur at the edge of Niagara Falls. It feels like there's so much pressure. There's no way to stop it. We're going to get in a fight. We can't have no control. It's out of our control. So I work with the couples to say, well, the interesting thing about Niagara Falls is upriver, it's calmer. You can get in and out. You can float around. You can swim. As you start getting toward the falls, there's these warning signs saying, hey, you in the barrel, get out. There's cables you can grab. And you start having a realization that the closer you get to the falls, the less power you have to change the process. Well, what if we could learn the warning signs farther upriver so we could get out of the river before we get to those points where we're going to say the words that we know bring up the great pancake incident of 2012 or whatever, all the stories in our marriages that we can say that are hurtful. And I have couples make lists of the warning signs. How do they know when things are getting out of control? Learn to watch each other. And in the book, there's a whole section that teaches couples how to develop that warning sign process so they don't have to feel out of control because they can see Niagara Falls coming.
Do you find that most of these discussions start out with he does this and he does that and he says this and he says that, and he winds up saying that's because you do this and you do that, and it's this codependency and one person feeding off the facial expression or the look or the turning the back and the walking the way, the throwing of the wedding ring. I mean, there's just a whole long list of things, and all those cause withdrawal. None of those things are opening or inviting. And that part of the problem that we're facing in marriages is this desire to withdraw to this safe place where you're now, bundling up and blocking off and building walls, as opposed to wrapping your arms around and bringing the partner into the equation.
Every now and then a couple walks in and says, my marriage would be better if I did this. And I just feel like embracing them. It's such an amazing thing to hear. And that couple is already 50% farther down the road than the couples who walk in and say, he did, she did, he did, she did. So there's something about self-awareness that I think is really valuable if you're going to involve change and transformation in the marriage. I call my practice transformational marriage, because I absolutely believe people who really want marital change have to transform who they are as people internally when they walk out of the office after the process.
You discuss a concept called unspoken truths. What are they and why are they so important in a marriage?
I believe that people start to tell stories to each other over the years about the way the marriage works. He's lazy. She's always late. He likes to work or values work more than he likes being with me and the kids. As those statements get made, the confirmation bias that my psychological field talks about comes into play. And if he doesn't act that way, that's ignored. But the one time he does, that's paid attention to. So suddenly the unspoken truth becomes the story that's told about the relationship. I can't depend on him. If I bring this up, it won't go well, so it's better if I'm quiet. Those are the kind of unspoken truths I encourage couples. I have some exercises in the book where couples can write those down. They can respond and do like incomplete sentences to say, my wife is, or it really makes me mad when he does. And when we have those kind of statements that are spoken, they're verbalized, they're said out loud, then the couple can sit down and say, do we want to keep believing this lie? If it's true, what do we need to change to make it not true? And if it's not true, maybe we should stop believing this unspoken truth and replace it with something that's more biblical, more honoring, and more uplifting.
In the couples that you see, what do you find is really, you talked about hope, you talked about the willingness to be transparent. This process, what's my expectation? I come in to see you, I think my marriage is on the rocks. We don't get along, we're now sleeping in separate rooms. The kids are starting to notice. I've kind of withdrawn. I spend more hours at the office than I would normally have to. I find excuses, all those things, and it finally winds up in your lap. Expectation of how long this process could take, should take, if two people are willing, and what if there is a reluctant partner? How do we navigate that from a time frame?
I've seen very, very motivated couples make changes in weeks, months, and 6 months. Things are in a massively different place. I've seen couples who were at the point of divorce. They had already called the divorce attorneys. They were kind of coming to counseling just to say they did it so that they wouldn't feel like they didn't try counseling. And then I tell them, well, you can call the attorneys anytime you want. Can you just give this 3 months and see if 3 months from now, if you really try to change and transform yourselves, you really still want to call the attorneys? And most of the time, the attorneys are still there on speed dial because they have them if they want them. But a lot of the time, couples look at that and say, wow, divorce is, in my opinion, highly overrated. It sounds good at the time, but in a lot of cases, divorce is a hard thing. There's a lot of destruction that comes from it. So yes, it can take a year or two for couples to make changes that are enveloped and become who they are. But small changes, being able to learn forgiveness, being able to understand what it looks like to not keep a scorecard of the other person and all the things they did wrong, those things can be done in a matter of months if a couple's seriously devoted and wants to come in and talk with a counselor, talk with a pastor, and say, how can this be different? For a lot of people, what I'm amazed by is they have no model to follow at all. They don't have a model of marriage. And part of the rationale and the thought process behind this book was to give couples, whether they have a faith basis or not, a model that is biblically based, that says, here's the principles that God teaches us that make relationships go well. And if we had a model like that, I think a lot of couples would say, wow, I'd probably rather choose that than divorce.
You mentioned the word forgiveness. You
Yes.
mentioned the word scorecard. I can imagine that there are many couples who are laying in wait they see an improvement, they come, they leave the counseling session, maybe they rode together, maybe you recommend they don't ride together. They come back home, a couple of days go by, they're 4 or 5 days away from the appointment, and he says something and she says, there you go again. Mm-hmm. Meaning she hadn't forgiven him in the first place, and she's now keeping a record. And even though 1 Corinthians tells us that love keeps no record of wrongs, that's not really true in the reality of what we're seeing. It's true in the reality of what biblical love is supposed to look like. But in reality, there's those quick triggers, those flashbacks. Do you help people find a way that to address this where they might go back, but they don't go back as far?
The forgiveness issue is so overwhelming. I had to give it a couple of chapters in the book. The ideas of forgiving the big stuff like affairs and betrayals and financial choices and all this kind of stuff. It's very hard not to see everything through that event that happened that defined the relationship. And so I have a belief that forgiveness involves several steps, one of which is saying, if I'm going to say, I'm sorry for what I did, I'm committing to engage in a repentance process that says, I'm going to figure out a way to not be that person anymore. The problem with that is that a lot of people, in what do we have in our society now? People just say, my bad. It's like, my bad, and everything's fine. And it's not fine, because forgiveness involves steps and actions to help the other person believe you're not going to do it again. On the other side of the ledger, that person has to be willing to consider, if you're really working hard to overcome what you did, I think the biblical model involves treating that other person as if they never did it. I don't think you can hold that against them and continue to expect. I had a wife tell me once, well, how would I ever believe he was actually on the golf course? That time back then, he wasn't on the golf course, he was with her. And so there's this process of saying, gosh, if I'm going to forgive, I have to mean it, and I have to mean I'm sorry, I'm going to change. And if I'm going to forgive on the other side of the equation, I have to believe that I'm going to treat that person as if they never did what they did.
The bottom line is that all of this is possible, but it takes work.
It takes a tremendous amount of work. It takes a desire to believe that God can help you in the process. And it takes an openness and a willingness to say, I'm not okay the way I am. I have to look at myself in the mirror, and I have to let God transform me.
In the cases where it really is one party who is really the culprit, the chronic offender, and we'll draw this personally, it was the Ron Welch. It wasn't the wife. It wasn't the kids. It wasn't. Right. It had to begin. Lord, let there be change, and let it begin in me. It takes an awfully strong person to do what you did. It takes an awfully unique person to be able to confess and to examine themselves and do that self-confession. What word of comfort? We've got about 2 minutes left. I'd like you to speak to that one that says that I'm struggling and I'm afraid to admit that it's me. I'm afraid to face the fact that I am the problem.
For me, part of the process was to be able to say, I know I'm weak. I know I have difficulties and challenges that I'm facing, but there are parts of me. This is not the only thing that defines me. I am not a controlling person and nothing else. I had to be able to say to myself, yes, I have elements that I need to work on, but I'm not a failure as a person. Because that was my fear, is that if I admitted those kind of problems, that, gosh, my wife wouldn't want to be with me. I didn't know if she'd even love me anymore. If I'm really that bad, it was easier to pretend it didn't exist. I think your listeners, if they're in that space, have to be willing to say, there's more to you than that. God created you larger and bigger and stronger than that, and he's able to heal all things and redeem all things. If you allow yourself to have that openness and that hope and that belief, then it's amazing what God can do when you give him the chance.
It takes a real man to be able to face up to a real God and be transparent and accept God's plan for his life. It takes a strong man who's willing to surrender his agenda for God's agenda, and God's agenda for marriage, and understanding that God instituted marriage. This is not a man's institution. This is an institution of God. And he instituted it for this reason: a man will leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one. A house divided against itself cannot stand. And yet we have these horrible examples, horrible entertainment industry, horrible agenda in politics that talks about the individual rights. And in this case, the individual is a compound unity. The individual rights are the rights of the couple. And if we begin to defend the rights of the individual, we're talking about the rights of the couple to enjoy life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and a loving marriage. Dr. Ron Welch, author of 10 Choices Successful Couples Make, The Secret to Love That Lasts a Lifetime. Thank you for sharing this great book with us. I'll be using this in premarital counseling. I recommend that you who are out there who are considering marriage, are newly married, or have been married for 20 years and are struggling with your marriage, that you grab a hold of this with a heart that says, I'm going to be open, honest, and sincere, and I'm going to walk through this because what I want is a marriage that is pleasing to God. Dr. Ron Welch, thank you so much for your time with us here on Revealing the Truth.
It's been a blessing. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. God bless. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.